Before the wager, before the world tour, there was a clock and a secret. Discover the untold story of Phileas Fogg in this original steampunk mystery set years before Around the World in 80 Days. If you love literary origin stories, Victorian intrigue, or simply a well-told tale, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and like to support more narrated adventures like this one. Your next great journey begins now. In the year of our Lord 1862, on a Tuesday of no particular distinction, Mr. Phileas Fogg, an English gentleman whose equanimity rivaled that of the Queen's sundial, completed his morning constitutional along Pall Mall with his customary economy of movement and expression. His steps, precise as the Greenwich chimes, took him from the Reform Club, where he had breakfasted alone on toast without crust and an egg boiled precisely 4 minutes, to his Savile Row residence, where his valet, a man named Ransom, stood sentinel with the door ajar exactly 30 seconds prior to his employer's arrival. "Anything of note in the post, Ransom?" inquired Mr. Fogg as he stepped across the threshold with all the gravity of a clock entering its next hour. "Only the Times, sir, and a circular from Moffat's patent ink remover," replied Ransom, presenting both as though they bore messages of state. Fogg accepted the newspaper and took his seat in the drawing-room, where not a tassel dared stray from its assigned symmetry. The fire crackled at a volume so moderate it might have been instructed to do so. The gentleman unfolded the Times and skimmed its columns with an efficiency that suggested each I had been trained to read separately. Midway through the second page, his gaze settled. It was a minor article, tucked between shipping notices and advertisements for ladies' elixirs. Mechanical mishap at Clerkenwell exhibition. A small fire broke out during yesterday's demonstration of Mr. Ignatius Grimble's synchronized horological array. The flames were quickly contained. No injuries reported. The incident occurred at precisely 11:12 a.m., say organizers. Mr. Fogg's brow furrowed, an imperceptible twitch to any but the most attentive observer. 11:12, he murmured. But the south-facing tower of Clerkenwell strikes its quarter bell only at 11:15. A discrepancy of 3 minutes. He consulted his pocket watch, which agreed with him as faithfully as a valet, and then the mantel clock, which offered the same verdict, albeit with slightly more flourish. 3 minutes, he repeated. Unaccounted for. To any other gentleman in London, nay, to the world entire, such a trifle would have passed unnoticed. But to Mr. Fogg, whose life was orchestrated to the rhythm of horology rather than human whim, the report felt not merely inaccurate but provocative. There was something about the name, too, Grimble, familiar, mechanical, a specter from some forgotten ledger in the back of his mind. He folded the newspaper and stood. "Ransom, have the morning coat pressed again. I believe I shall step out after luncheon." "Of course, sir," said Ransom, concealing his surprise with the finesse of a man who had learned to treat anomalies in his master's behavior as he would a dropped stitch. Quietly corrected, never discussed. Fogg glanced once more at the mantel clock. 3 minutes. Lost in the city like a misplaced sovereign. He could not say why it mattered, only that it did. And for a man such as Phileas Fogg, that was reason enough to pursue it. It was precisely 5 minutes after luncheon, a meal consisting of cold beef, pickled walnut, and a single glass of Madeira, that Mr. Fogg was interrupted in the midst of verifying the longitude of his mantel clock against the latest almanac. There came a rapping, 3 succinct knocks, upon the door, and Ransom entered with the air of a man delivering either a message from Parliament or a demand from the gas company. "A courier from Clerkenwell, sir," he said. "Left this without a name." The item in question was an envelope of heavy creamstock, its seal pressed with a curious signet resembling a spoked wheel or perhaps the internal gearing of a watch. Fogg took the letter, examined it briefly without altering his expression, and then opened it with the silver blade he reserved for correspondence. The contents were brief, handwritten in a neat but tremulous script. "Mr. Fogg, if ever you have cherished the integrity of a second and the dignity of a minute, I beseech you to attend me. My name you may remember, Ignatius Grimble. Once I turned time to serve mankind. Now time turns against me. I ask you, not as a man of flesh but as a brother of precision, come to number 47 Whittock Lane, Clerkenwell, before the 4th stroke after 2 p.m. tomorrow." There is no more time to lose. I.G. Fogg reread the letter twice. That the name stirred a memory was certain, though it surfaced only as a vague impression. Gears, copper tools, a younger man with soot about his coat and a mind racing faster than his hands. He spoke aloud, though to no one in particular. Ignatius Grimble, horologist. Inventor. Vanished from the papers 6 years ago. Trouble, sir? Asked Ransom, who lingered a moment longer than etiquette permitted. Possibly, said Fogg. Or opportunity wearing the disguise of disorder. The valet offered a thin cough, as if uncertain whether commentary was appropriate. Fogg, without removing his gaze from the letter, continued. Prepare walking gloves, hat, and overcoat for tomorrow at 1:45 p.m. sharp. I shall be making an excursion. To Clerkenwell, sir? Indeed. Whittock Lane. It appears I have been summoned by a fellow servant of the second hand. Ransom, who had once been employed by a painter and never trusted anything he could not mix with oil, merely nodded. As the door shut behind him, Fogg stood alone in the drawing-room, the late afternoon light bending faintly through the windows, illuminating the rows of perfectly dustless books and silent clocks that populated the room like watchful sentinels. He looked once more at the letter, then tucked it inside the inner breast pocket of his waistcoat. It was, he thought, an odd phrasing, not as a man of flesh but as a brother of precision. He did not yet know whether it was nonsense or necessity, but the invitation oddly comforted him. Someone out there still understood the dignity of the minute. And for Mr. Phileas Fogg, that was almost reason enough. At precisely 1 minute before the hour of 2 on the following afternoon, Mr. Phileas Fogg alighted from a hansom cab at the mouth of Whittock Lane, Clerkenwell, a district once known for its monastic order and now better remembered for the cacophony of wheels, wires, and the relentless whir of invention. Clerkenwell in 1862 had become a kind of metallic garden, each shop a flower bed of eccentric devices, each tradesman a cultivator of strange contraptions. Here one might purchase a self-stirring teacup, there a machine for letter folding and self-sealing, all admirable in theory, rarely reliable in practice. Number 47 presented itself modestly, its soot brick facade nearly indistinguishable from its neighbors, save for a brass placard just above the bell pull, engraved with the words, A Grimble, Chronometry and Mechanical Consultation. Mr. Fogg pulled the bell precisely as the 4th stroke after 2 o'clock echoed from a nearby chapel's bell tower. The sound it produced was more of a wheeze than a chime. A long pause ensued. Just as Fogg raised his hand for a second attempt, the door opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a narrow figure, perhaps 5 feet and a sliver tall, whose spectacles magnified each eye to the size of a pocket watch. "Are you?" the young woman began, peering upward. "Phileas Fogg," he answered. She stepped aside, gesturing silently for him to enter. The hallway beyond was narrow and dim, lined with timepieces in various states of vivisection. Springs splayed, pendulums removed, faces blank as lunar craters. The scent of brass filings and oil hung heavily in the air. "Mr. Grimble is in the back," said the woman, leading him through a maze of overturned stools, dangling chains, and the occasional mechanized bird whose gears wheezed in feeble imitation of song. "I was told to expect someone," she added, as if the nature of that someone remained in doubt. Fogg inclined his head. "And you are?" "Clara Bellamy, apprentice, assistant, and occasional bearer of tea," she replied with an economy of courtesy that almost rivaled his own. They entered a room which might once have served as a workshop but now resembled a battlefield where time had lost its grip. A towering brass construct stood in the center. A lattice of interlocking wheels, winding levers, and coiled springs that spiraled toward the ceiling like the skeleton of some mechanical colossus. Seated at its base, hunched over a workbench cluttered with diagrams and wires, was the man himself. "Ignatius Grimble?" said Fogg. The figure turned. Grimble's face was drawn, his beard longer than custom allowed, his spectacles cracked at one edge, but his eyes, bright, fervent, and slightly unhinged, shone like those of a prophet who had seen either God or mathematics. "Mr. Fogg," he breathed, rising. "You came. Time bless you." I received your letter, said Fogg. Its urgency was persuasive. Grimble gestured with both arms to the towering device behind him. Behold the regulator. My life's work. My ruin. My salvation. Fogg blinked once, as though weighing the man's sanity against the cost of his cab fare. It is a remarkable contraption, he said, not as flattery, but as observable fact. It is more than that, Grimble insisted. It is the soul of order, the master from which all clocks may take their cue. Imagine. No more missed trains, no more early milkmen, no bells rung at the wrong quarter. One signal, one source, London synchronized. And yet you wrote of crisis, said Fogg. Grimble's shoulders slumped. The regulator is scheduled to begin its first transmission at week's end, but it deviates. Not always. Just enough to sow chaos. I have recalculated the sequence 57 times. Something is off. He looked up, eyes flickering. And I fear it may not be mechanical. Fogg said nothing for a moment. Then, why summon me? Because, said Grimble, stepping closer. You live your life like a metronome, Mr. Fogg. If anyone can sense the discord in a ticking heart, it is you. The words hung in the oily air. Fogg regarded the regulator again, this time with more than detached interest. He felt, as he rarely did, the faintest stirrings of something beyond logic. Curiosity. The regulator loomed above them like an idol of industry, its brass faceplate etched with Roman numerals, its hands at rest in defiance of all convention, suspended at 11:59, as though waiting for the universe itself to catch up. Grimble moved with the uneven gait of a man who had long since forsaken symmetry for inspiration. He ducked beneath a copper arch and gestured toward a dense forest of cogs, pistons, and a pendulum encased in crystal. It should beat once every second, he said, voice taut. And it does until it doesn't. A stutter here, a tremor there. I thought it the brass, then the casing, then the air pressure. But no, it is neither whether nor where. Fogg stepped closer, observing in silence. The regulator gave a slow tick, then another, then hesitated imperceptibly, but enough for the trained senses of a man who arranged his entire life in even measures. That delay, he said quietly. 3/5 of a second. Grimble exhaled, a strange half-laugh. You see it too. I do not see, Fogg corrected. I hear, and what is audible is often measurable. Miss Bellamy, leaning against a tall chest of drawers filled with delicate tools, spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. You're the first visitor who's noticed. Most just call it charming. Charming is not a quality I assign to temporal inconsistencies, replied Fogg without looking at her. She snorted, not impolitely. I gathered. Grimble shuffled to a writing desk covered in schematics that might have belonged in Leonardo's graveyard. He pulled free a vellum sheet with elegant calligraphy and thrust it toward Fogg. Here, the signal algorithm. It's designed to regulate every public timepiece that receives it. Once launched, all clocks in London will adjust to it. Precisely, automatically, instantly. Fogg studied the diagram with the attention of a man reading scripture. Ingenious, he admitted. Also dangerous. Grimble nodded. That is why it must be perfect. An error of even 1/2 second will cascade into hours, days. Calendars could collapse. You risk dismantling the very order you wish to impose, Fogg said, folding the diagram with care. Have you considered dismantling the regulator instead? The old man flinched as though struck. No, Mr. Fogg. I would sooner unmake myself. There was silence, filled only by the ambient hum of tiny motors. You know, Clara said suddenly, brushing a speck of oil from her sleeve, the professor here speaks of perfection like it's divine, but perfection can't be measured. Not really. Fogg turned to her. No? Then what is the purpose of the chronometer? To measure the illusion, she said simply. Grimble waved a dismissive hand. She's a romantic. You must forgive her. Not at all, said Fogg, eyes narrowed. I find romanticism tolerable when accompanied by accuracy. Clara smirked. Then you'll find me tolerable about half the time. Grimble pressed a switch on the base panel of the regulator. A low hum began, followed by the soft chime of harmonic resonance. Notes pure and round, that seemed to vibrate in the bones more than in the ear. 3 days, said Grimble. That's all the time I have. The ministry expects a demonstration. And if I cannot correct the delay, the city will ring wrong, Fogg said quietly. Grimble nodded. And I will be finished. Fogg looked again at the automaton. The ticking had resumed, yet the discrepancy remained, small, almost imperceptible, but as real to him as a skipped breath. He straightened his lapels. Then we shall have to uncover the discord. We? Clara asked, one brow raised. Fogg turned to Grimble. I assume you would not have summoned me to observe failure. No, the clockmaker said with sudden fervor. I summoned you to prevent it. Then I shall require full access to your notes, and absolute quiet between the hours of 5 and 7. Grimble beamed, clasping his hands. Done. Clara folded her arms. You'll forgive me if I don't curtsy. Fogg blinked once, then set his watch to local noon as defined by the regulator. The investigation had begun. The workshop became a monastery of mechanisms. For 2 days, Mr. Fogg returned at the same hour, 1:47 p.m. precisely, and remained until the onset of evening, poring over blueprints, inspecting gear teeth beneath a jeweler's lens, and conducting silent measurements with a metronome he produced from his own waistcoat pocket. Clara Bellamy, observing from a safe distance, often remarked to herself that never had she seen a man examine so much while saying so little. He dissects silence, she muttered under her breath on more than one occasion, as if it were a frog pinned to felt. But on the third morning the silence fractured. Miss Bellamy. Grimble's voice echoed through the corridor like a cracked bell. She entered the rear chamber to find the old man bent over the regulator's housing, perspiring despite the early hour. He's been inside it, he said without turning. Inside what? The regulator. My machine. Grimble pointed to a set of screws freshly worn by an ill-fitting tool. Tampered, adjusted, not by my hand, nor yours. Clara frowned. You're sure? Positive. See this coil? He indicated a copper wire that had been rerouted through a secondary channel. It's been bridged. Someone's rerouted the dampening signal. The pulse is corrupted. She stepped forward and squinted. Could this be accidental? Miss Bellamy, said Fogg, who had entered silently through the side door and now stood behind them with a measuring rod in hand. If disorder were accidental, the universe would have long since imploded. Clara turned to face him, exasperated. Do you ever speak figuratively? I speak efficiently, he replied. It saves time. Pity it does nothing for company. Fogg ignored the jab. His attention was fixed on the wiring. This alteration, he murmured, tracing the route with a gloved finger, was intentional. The saboteur is not merely meddling. He understands the system. Grimble sat down heavily upon a stool, his composure fraying. I feared as much. There are only 3 men in London who could interpret my schematics. One's in Geneva. One's blind. The third, he hesitated. Clara finished for him. Is Horace Ledbury. Fogg looked up, the name registering faintly. A competitor? He asked. A former partner, Grimble said. We built the prototype together. But Horace, he wanted to sell it to the Ministry of War, to control naval timekeeping, artillery schedules, troop movement. I refused. He left with a copy of the plans. Clara muttered. And half the patience of a saint. Fogg stood and turned toward Grimble. Why did you not mention this earlier? The clockmaker shook his head. Because I did not wish to believe he would stoop to sabotage. Fogg's eyes narrowed. Faith, he said flatly, is a noble sentiment, but poorly suited to horology. Clara let out a short, involuntary laugh. You have a talent, Mr. Fogg, for making truth sound like an insult. I consider that a virtue. She rolled her eyes, but there was the faintest trace of a smile at the corners of her mouth. Grimble, meanwhile, rose with difficulty, his hand trembling as he reached for a spanner. "If Ledbury is behind this," he said, "he means to demonstrate that my system is unsafe. He wants to ruin it before the public trial." Fogg nodded slowly. "Then he must be allowed to think he's succeeded." Clara looked at him, startled. "You mean to what? Pretend?" "I mean to control the narrative of failure," Fogg said calmly. "Let him see the system stutter. Let him gloat. He may act again. And when he does," he tapped the casing of the regulator, "we shall catch him by the tick." The room fell into thoughtful silence. Grimble looked up, something new flickering behind his weary eyes. "Are you always so confident in your deductions, Mr. Fogg?" "No," Fogg replied, "but I am invariably precise." The following morning arrived beneath a low ceiling of cloud, the London sky graying like the inside of an unpolished watch case. Fogg, as was his custom, began the day at 6:42 a.m. precisely, taking 1/2 cup of black tea and a slice of dry toast. Yet, unlike most mornings, this one found him uncharacteristically pensive. He sat at his escritoire, unmoving, save for the metronome atop the desk that kept rhythm in quiet defiance of his stillness. The letter from Grimble lay folded beside it, unopened though already thrice read. The tick-tock was soothing until, at the 94th beat, it stuttered. Just once. Yet once was enough. Fogg's gaze drifted, not forward, but backward into the recesses of memory, an act he usually considered as wasteful as warming tea twice. The room was cold, the air salted from Portsmouth's wind. A young Phileas Fogg, no more than 9, stood with hands at his sides and a pocket watch in his palm. The time was 06:05. He had arrived late. Across from him, Admiral Sebastian Fogg, Royal Navy, stood in full dress. His white-gloved hand held no cane, yet struck the air with the force of one. "You will recite the 10 points of chronometric discipline," the Admiral said. "Now." Phileas, his voice clear but uninflected, began. 1. A gentleman is never early, lest he reveal uncertainty. 2. A gentleman is never late, lest he cause disorder. The Admiral's lips twitched upward, not in pride, but in anticipation of error. 3. A gentleman accounts for all drift. 4. He honors the minute as sacred. On it went the catechism of time. Behind him, the chronometers on the mantel ticked in solemn accord. He remembered now. He had been late due to a funeral procession on High Street. He had paused to let it pass. He had chosen courtesy over punctuality. When he reached the end of the 10th point, the Admiral removed the watch from his hand. "You are 5 minutes behind the world, Phileas. And 5 minutes behind the world is 5 minutes behind history." Back in the present, the older Fogg sat perfectly still, his fingers curled against the leather armrest. It had not been cruelty, precisely, that governed his father, but something colder, the conviction that time was the last empire man might control, and that any rebellion against it, be it by sentiment or delay, was treason. He stood, slowly. The metronome resumed its rhythm, but now its ticks seemed louder, more accusatory. Fogg closed the lid gently, as though silencing a dissenting voice. Later that day, at the workshop, Clara greeted him with a thin-lipped expression somewhere between irritation and concern. "You're 5 minutes early," she observed. "Unusual but not unprecedented," he replied, removing his gloves. She tilted her head. "Everything all right?" Fogg paused. "Punctuality is not always a matter of precision," he said. "Sometimes it is inheritance." Before Clara could inquire further, Grimble called out from the interior. "Fogg, come see this." They followed the old man to the regulator. He pointed to the pulse coil, now humming with an unnatural rhythm. "He's done it again," Grimble muttered. "The signal interference, it's back. Adjusted further." Clara narrowed her eyes. "He's accelerating the pulse, trying to force a total cascade." Fogg's gaze remained on the coils, but his mind was elsewhere, on the boy with the pocket watch, and the Admiral who mistook fear for precision. He spoke at last, voice low but resolved. "Then we must not only catch him, We must catch him on time. The regulator convulsed. There is no other word befitting the movement. A shudder that ran not through its limbs, for it had none, but through its very logic. A tick became a stutter, the stutter a gasp, and then silence. The three of them stood frozen before it. Grimble was the first to move, lurching forward to press the emergency disengage lever. A copper crank that groaned with effort. Sparks crackled along the signal plates. One of the side gauges burst with a snap, ejecting a puff of white smoke. "She's pulsing erratically," Grimble cried. "The override should have shut it down." "It's feeding on its own feedback loop," Clara said, already reaching for a coil spanner. "Like a serpent swallowing its tail." Phileas Fogg did not move. He watched. The regulator's primary pendulum trembled, then stalled, dead still at 6 degrees past vertical. Time had stopped, or at least one machine's idea of time had. Fogg stepped forward, not with haste but with the deliberation of a man walking across a frozen pond whose cracks are audible but not yet visible. He turned to Grimble. "The main oscillator. When was it last recalibrated?" 3 days ago. "By me," Grimble said, wiping his brow. "It was precise to the thousandth. And yet it failed. I recalculated every—" "Then your calculations," Fogg interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness, "are no longer sufficient." Grimble recoiled as if struck. Clara stepped between them. "Enough," she said, voice taut. "Blame later. Containment now." But Grimble turned away. "He's right," he said bitterly. "All these years, and still I misjudged the weight of a moment." He sank into his chair and buried his face in ink-stained hands. Clara moved to his side but said nothing. Her eyes, however, turned to Fogg with something closer to accusation than inquiry. "You're supposed to see everything," she said. "How did this get past you?" Fogg opened his mouth to reply, but for once, no words came. He had followed the rhythm, traced every stutter, every deviation. But the saboteur had not merely broken the pattern, he had rewritten it. The regulator, that vast brass promise of order, now lay dormant. Its last signal had already transmitted outward, invisible but irreversible. "Public clocks," Grimble whispered. "The test sites." He stood suddenly, teetering like a man emerging from a dream. "We have to recall the signal." "You can't," Clara said gently. "It's been broadcast." Grimble's shoulders slumped. Then, in a voice hoarse with defeat, "I have failed. My life's work, and I've given London confusion instead of clarity." Fogg, who had said nothing for nearly 2 minutes, spoke then, quietly. "Do you recall," he said, "the Greenwich fire in '55? A failure in the telegraph coil. They corrected it, not by sending a new pulse, but by rerouting the observatory's auxiliary clock through a subcarrier frequency." Grimble blinked. Yes, but—" "You built the regulator with 2 coils," Fogg continued. "One primary, one hidden, in case of static interruption. But the subcarrier isn't timed to broadcast." "No," said Fogg, "but it can echo." Clara's eyes widened. "You mean a reverberation signal? One that resonates rather than replaces?" Fogg nodded. "A delayed correction, subtle but cumulative. By tomorrow's sunrise, the clocks will realign themselves. Provided," he added, "we can construct the correction wave precisely." "And if we can't?" Clara asked. Fogg glanced at the inert pendulum. "Then London shall chime to the wrong hour. And so, perhaps, shall I." The admission shocked even him. Grimble looked up, the glimmer of hope behind his eyes barely alight. "Do you think we can manage it?" Fogg considered. Then, with that same calm that had carried him through storm and fire drills and 1,000 irrelevancies of society, "I don't know. But it is no longer a matter of control. It is a matter of correction." He turned to the diagrams, unrolling a fresh sheet with slow precision. Behind him, the regulator lay silent. Its rebellion paused, but not yet undone. Night had fallen over Clerkenwell. The workshop, emptied of urgency for the first time in days, stood hushed. The regulator, disabled, disconnected, and disgraced, loomed in the center of the room like a fallen monument. Clara and Grimble had retired upstairs, the former muttering about pulse decay curves in her sleep, the latter subdued and sorrowful in equal measure. Phileas Fogg remained. He sat alone at the long worktable, a brass oil lamp burning at its lowest flame beside him, casting golden light across pages of schematics and diagrams that once promised order and now served only as a catalogue of failure. And yet he was not studying the diagrams. His hand rested instead upon a small, leather-bound volume, found wedged in a drawer beneath the regulator's master coil. It was a journal. Grimble's, by all evidence, though the handwriting was less angular than his present scrawl. More contemplative, more fluid. Fogg turned the first page. To measure is to seek. To master is to fear. In building a perfect clock, I have learned more about imperfection than time. Fogg raised a brow. He turned the page again. The regulator was never meant to enslave time, only to understand it. But understanding has a cost. A moment, once observed too closely, begins to distort. The second you try to bind the minute rebels. He read on, entranced. Each entry offered not calculations or formulae but musings, philosophies, doubts. One passage struck him like a sudden gust in a still corridor. Clocks are obedient, but not wise. They tick, they toll, they keep our meetings and our meals. But they cannot forgive. Only a human can do that. To err and recover, that is not disorder. That is harmony. Fogg leaned back, the journal resting in his lap. Harmony. Not punctuality. Not control. But something quieter, more intricate, like the subtle adjustment of a pendulum to compensate for changing air pressure. A resonance. For the first time in years, perhaps since childhood, Phileas Fogg permitted himself to feel something that could almost be called warmth. A recognition that there were truths beyond the arithmetic of time. Clara's voice came unbidden to his mind. You treat life like a timetable, Mr. Fogg. Doesn't it exhaust you never missing a step? He had not answered then. He did now. Yes, he whispered to the empty room. It does. He rose and crossed to the regulator, now still and harmless. His hand moved to the base plate, brushing aside dust and solder. There, embedded in the brass frame, was an inscription, worn with age. Built to regulate, not to replace. Set your own clock with care. He looked at his pocket watch, opened its face, and for the first time in recent memory, allowed its hands to drift 6 seconds behind the room's mantelpiece. Not from oversight, by choice. Fogg closed the journal with care and extinguished the lamp. The darkness that followed was not total. It was dappled with faint moonlight, enough to outline the edges of clocks and tools and half-formed ideas. He made his way to the door, pausing only to listen, once, to the silence. And in that silence he heard something new. Not order. Possibility. By the time the first light of dawn turned the rooftops of Clerkenwell a reluctant gray, Phileas Fogg was already standing at the regulator's console, sleeves rolled, brass compasses in hand, marking arcs upon a vellum overlay with the patience of a cartographer drawing an uncharted coast. Clara entered quietly, a teacup in each hand. You've not slept. I've rarely found sleep more productive than thinking, Fogg replied, accepting the cup with a faint nod. She tilted her head toward the spread of diagrams. You found something? I believe so, but you may not approve. That's practically an invitation. He gestured to the overlay, where a new sequence had been plotted, its rhythm irregular, almost musical in its variances. This, he said, tapping a series of points with the compass tip, is not a correction in the traditional sense. Clara leaned in. That's not a static signal. That's a phase-shifted loop. Precisely, a reverberation signal. It does not force the clocks to match the regulator, it coaxes them. It will realign time not through domination, but resonance. Clara blinked. It's risky. True precision, said Fogg. Often is. Grimble arrived moments later, his expression bearing the pallor of insomnia and fragile hope. You've a solution? A proposition, Fogg corrected, presenting the annotated draft. We cannot replace the corrupted signal, but we can overlay it. The auxiliary coil remains intact. Yes. Grimble nodded slowly. And if we echo a signal there, the public clocks might correct themselves gradually. Subtle shifts, said Fogg, each quarter hour aligning closer to the intended state. It will take a full day to complete. And if it fails? Clara asked. Fogg closed the overlay and met her gaze. Then London shall run on imperfection. But it will be our imperfection. Grimble exhaled. It's unorthodox. So is sabotage, Fogg replied. There was a silence, filled only by the faint ticking of an ordinary wall clock. A modest device, keeping imperfect time. Mr. Fogg, Grimble said, this echo signal of yours, it will require delicate calibration. The oscillation must be guided in real time. I am aware. You'd need to sit with it, guide it minute by minute. For hours. Fogg nodded. I intend to. Clara folded her arms. That doesn't sound like you. Sitting in uncertainty. Fogg's lips curled. Not quite a smile, but not its opposite. Miss Bellamy, he said. It is not uncertainty I fear. It is stasis. Grimble placed a hand on the regulator's console. Then let us begin. Before the city wakes and finds itself misled by a rogue heartbeat. As the trio took their stations, Grimble adjusting voltages, Clara reconfiguring signal dampeners, and Fogg seated before the auxiliary interface, there was a curious sense in the room. Not confidence. Conviction. The first pulse was sent at exactly 7 a.m. It did not ring like a bell, nor flash like lightning. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, a murmur against the great machinery of the world. But it moved, and for Phileas Fogg, who had spent a lifetime resisting the pull of all things unpredictable, that movement, uncertain, imperfect, but chosen, was the most precise step he had ever taken. The morning passed without spectacle. No great clangor accompanied the transmission. No fanfare echoed down the streets of Clerkenwell. And yet, in the shops of Marylebone, in the signal box of Charing Cross, and upon the tower dial of St. Dunstan in the east, the hands of the clocks, those ever-faithful, ever-fickle indicators of human ambition, began to shift. Not all at once, not uniformly, but with a kind of quiet conviction. Each minute slightly truer. Each quarter hour, nearer alignment. Inside the workshop, Fogg remained seated at the auxiliary console, his right hand upon the dial, his eyes fixed on the metering scope. Clara monitored the pulse echo, adjusting the amplitude with incremental turns of the rheostat. Grimble hovered like a parson at the edge of his altar, too reverent to touch, too anxious to pace. At precisely 11:15 a.m., Clara glanced up from her calculations. The Greenwich signal just returned a parity ping, she said. Grimble's brows lifted. Clean. Clara nodded. Within 0.03 of standard deviation. Fogg allowed himself a single blink of acknowledgement. It's holding, he said. The phase drift is decaying on schedule. Grimble exhaled as if he had been submerged for hours. The clocks, he said softly. They're realigning. Clara cracked her knuckles. And the ministry doesn't need to know how close they came to ringing in the age of horological anarchy. Grimble chuckled. A dry, wheezing sound, like an old bell finally struck true. Oh, they'll know. But perhaps they'll also understand. Fogg turned to him. Do not mistake their silence for comprehension. Grimble smiled. I shan't. But I'll take what I can get. They lapsed into silence again. The workshop, once chaotic with scattered tools and burnt diagrams, now felt, if not tidy, at least resolved. The regulator, inert but whole, stood quiet in its housing. Fogg rose from the console. That completes the final correction, he said, consulting his watch, which now aligned exactly with the mantel clock, the auxiliary dial, and the tower bell in the square outside. Clara noticed. You've set your watch again. Fogg regarded her. Yes. Back to your old precision? He paused, then shook his head, ever so slightly. No, he said. To a new one. She raised an eyebrow. Is that meant to sound wise or vague? Possibly both, he said. Grimble placed a hand on the regulator's frame and looked to Fogg. You've done more than correct a signal, Mr. Fogg. You've redeemed the intent. Fogg nodded once. Intent is not always enough, but occasionally it deserves a second. The words hung in the air like a chime echoing past its strike. Clara looked around the workshop, now beginning to feel like itself again, though something subtle had shifted. Funny, she said. You arrived looking like the sort of man who could only see time in columns and rows. And now, she replied. You look like someone who might occasionally listen to it. Fogg offered no denial. He gathered his gloves, placed the closed schematics in a folder, and with a final look at the regulator, less as a machine than as a question answered, turned toward the door. I shall take my leave, he said. Grimble approached and extended his hand. Fogg regarded it for a beat, then shook it. Firmly, precisely. Thank you, Grimble said. For what? For helping me remember that error is not always the enemy. Fogg inclined his head. Nor certainty always a friend. And with that, he stepped out into the late morning, where the bells of the city now tolled true. The bells of Clerkenwell struck two in unambiguous harmony. Not a chime too early, not an echo too late. Phileas Fogg, now restored to his usual composure but not, perhaps, to his former self, stood in the front room of number 47 Whittock Lane, hat in hand, gloves neatly folded beneath one arm. His coat was buttoned, his pocket watch returned to its place. And yet there lingered about him not disorder but something subtler, a softness, the faint easing of a spring once wound too tightly. Grimble extended a worn envelope, sealed with the same gear-shaped emblem that had marked the first summons. Not a payment, the old man said. A record. Inside are the corrected schematics and my final annotations, in case you ever wish to design a clock that thinks for itself. Fogg accepted the envelope with a nod, tucking it away without ceremony. I appreciate the confidence, he said, but I prefer to think for myself. Grimble chuckled. That's more than I can say for most engineers. From the workbench, Clara approached with a small, flat box in her hands. Lacquered oak, polished but unadorned. She held it out to Fogg. Something we made, she said. Together. Fogg raised an eyebrow. A collaborative timepiece? Of sorts. He opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of deep blue velvet, was a pocket watch. Sleek, undecorated, elegant. The hands were of darkened steel, the casing engraved only with a modest initial, F. But it was the inscription within the cover lid that gave him pause. To measure is not always to control. He looked up. It's not factory standard. Clara smiled. Neither are you. Fogg closed the case and returned it to his vest pocket with uncharacteristic care. He did not speak, which was perhaps the sincerest thanks he could offer. I shall ensure it keeps faithful time, he said after a moment. Let it wander now and then, Clara replied. See what happens. He inclined his head, a gesture as close to amusement as he permitted in daylight. Then, with measured steps, he turned toward the door. Grimble called after him. Will you be returning to the Reform Club? Or has our chaos frightened you off? Fogg paused at the threshold. No, he said without turning. In fact, I believe I may arrive late. And with that, he stepped once more into the thoroughfare, where the city thrummed in subtle rhythm, horses' hooves, gas lamps hissing, market bells tolling. He merged into the current not as an anomaly, nor as a metronome walking among men, but as something else. A gentleman, yes, but one who had tested the bounds of certainty, and found that time, like travel, sometimes rewarded those who did not hold it too tightly. Savile Row, in the waning light of late afternoon, was quiet. The gas lamps had not yet been lit. The shadows were long, like the hands of a clock stretching lazily across a dial not yet wound. Phileas Fogg entered his residence with his usual silent grace. Ransom, his ever-attentive valet, took his hat and gloves without remark, though his right eyebrow arched by precisely 1 degree. You are 45 minutes beyond your habitual return, sir, he said. Quite so, Fogg replied, loosening his cravat. You may cancel this evening's billiards engagement. Ransom blinked. Sir, I believe I shall write instead. Fogg ascended to the drawing room, where everything remained in perfect order, the rug aligned to the hearth, the chairs positioned with geometric accuracy, the clock above the mantel ticking with subdued dignity. And yet, there was something imperceptibly changed. The man who entered the room did not pace to check the barometer. He did not recalibrate the clock against the second chronometer. He did not ring for tea at the usual quarter past the hour. Instead, he approached the escritoire and opened a leather-bound ledger, the same he had used for years to record deviations, intervals, and minutes gained or lost in the great machinery of his life. He dipped his pen and began, not with numerals, but words. This week, I permitted time to err, and it did not crumble. I witnessed delay, and it did not dissolve order. I observed imperfection, and found in it a curious kind of peace. He paused. The pen hovered, then continued. Perhaps precision need not be pursued as conquest. Perhaps it may be invited, like a guest who is always late, yet worth waiting for. Fogg closed the journal. From his waistcoat he withdrew the new pocket watch. Simple, quiet, and faithful. He opened the lid. The inscription gleamed. To measure is not always to control. A faint sound reached his ear far off, from the direction of Piccadilly. A ship's horn, perhaps, or a train whistle. Some vessel, somewhere, departing not on time, but on purpose. He stood at the window, hands folded behind him. The world, he thought, was vast. Not merely in distance, but in unpredictability. In the irregular tempo of its moments. In the thrilling uncertainty of its horizons. A curious notion took hold, one he might have dismissed days ago as folly. What if time were not the enemy of experience, but its companion? And just then, he made a small, invisible decision. Promise, perhaps, that one day he would follow time, not to control it, but to travel with it, wherever it might lead. And so the clock ticked on, and Phileas Fogg, the most punctual of men, let it tick freely. Just once, just long enough. Before the wager, before the world tour, there was a clock and a secret. Discover the untold story of Phileas Fogg in this original steampunk mystery set years before Around the World in 80 Days. If you love literary origin stories, Victorian intrigue, or simply a well-told tale, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and like to support more narrated adventures like this one. Your next great journey begins now.